Over the next few weeks, as we move towards Easter weekend, we'll be looking at some of the last things that Jesus said to his disciples before he was killed. In fact, some of his most profound statements actually happened right before he died. They were written down by 4 guys named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know them in the Bible as the Gospels. And whether or not you believe everything you've heard about Jesus, many would say that his actual words and the way that he lived have shaped history and culture in a positive way. And the fact that they were written down is a good thing as well. Because I don't know about you, but I tend to forget a lot. Our forgetfulness can be one of the biggest barriers to healthy relationships. We only remember what we want to remember. Some call this selective memory. Remembering our version of what happened, or only remembering certain parts and erasing the rest. This same thing can happen in our connection and our relationship with God. We can focus so much on what's happening in front of us that we forget what God has already done for us in the past. In fact, I think Jesus knew about us. He knew that about us. He knew that we would be forgetful. So he shares something with his closest friends to help them out before it even becomes a problem. So Jesus and his disciples, which were his closest friends and followers, were having dinner. But it wasn't just any meal. It was the Passover meal, which was a huge, important traditional celebration. What the disciples didn't realize was that it would be their last meal with Jesus before he died. Just real quick, imagine if you were having one last conversation with the people that you love most. What would you say before you left? I feel like I wouldn't know what to say, but I know that I would want them to never forget it. But before we get exactly to what Jesus said, let's talk about this dinner party and what it was all about. Hundreds of years before Jesus' arrival on earth, God miraculously saved the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. So God sent a messenger, Moses, to request the enslaved people to be released. Then every time Pharaoh said no, God sent a new plague to get under his skin and speed up the process. The last plague was really awful though. The firstborn child of every family died. It's morbid, I know. For the Israelite families, however, there was a way out. They were told to place some lamb's blood on their doors as a sign that they were the Israelite people. In the night, God would pass over the firstborn male in those homes and allow him to live. It caused so much pain in Egypt that Pharaoh finally allowed them to leave. It was the end of slavery and a new beginning for the Israelite people. From that moment on, the Israelites, now known as the Jewish people, have had a tradition of remembering the Passover. They have a meal to celebrate how God rescued their ancestors. They gather around a table, much like many of us do for the holidays, and retell the story of how they were once slaves. But their God rescued them. They've made a habit of remembering. Just like many of our holiday traditions include food, so does theirs. Part of the meal involved eating bread that didn't have yeast in it, so it was really thin, and then, of course, drinking wine. This brings us back to the table where Jesus is celebrating. They probably all knew how the dinner was supposed to go, how the story was supposed to be told. But then, Jesus does something new. Check it out. He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it into pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." Even though they may not have understood what Jesus meant, they knew that he had just changed the meaning of their entire tradition. The bread and the wine represented his body and its blood. He was saying that these things now represent my incredible love for you, which has compelled me to live with you and die for you. every time you eat this bread and drink this wine, I want you to remember me, to remember my sacrifice for you, to remember my great love for you. Passover was a special time of remembering, but what about the bread and the wine? Jewish people had those every day. It was their normal food. Jesus made two of the most ordinary parts of their lives significant. Jesus wanted them to remember him every time they ate, every time they drank. Why? Because Jesus knew that life would be difficult and painful, not just for the disciples, but for everyone who read his words in the future, including us. Jesus knows that we tend to forget. So before he left, he taught the disciples to remember, because remembering reminds us of what Jesus has done, is doing, and will continue to do. For those of you who have been following Jesus for a long time, I'm guessing that there have been some significant moments that you can remember. In those moments, it's easy to trust him. It's easy to know that he's there and that he's good. But I'm also guessing that you don't feel that way every single day of your life. It's easy to feel far away or forget why you ever trusted Jesus in the first place. If that's you, I want you to know something. Jesus hasn't changed. He's the same as he was when you first met him. He's the same as he was when you first experienced him. God does not change. We just have to remember who God is and what God has done for us. We just have to remember who he is and what he's done for us. Those two things to keep in mind. Here's two more to keep in mind. Remembering with other people is powerful, but remembering also takes work. It helps us see God in the past so that we can trust him in the present. I want to leave you with this question. Who am I? It's a big question, I know. Trying to answer that can feel overwhelming, but what if you actually started living like you knew who you are? What would it look like if you started to live like you were an exclusive drop from the God of the universe, using you to reveal to others what God's love is actually like? So go out there and love those around you like Jesus intended.